As God had said from the very beginning, Paro would refuse to let Israel leave even for 3 days to worship him. This week's Parsha Bo starts with a prelude to the 8th plague, the plague of locusts. As God had said, Paro refused to let Israel leave to worship God. The plague of locusts then struck Egypt. Paro begged Moshe to remove the plague, promising anything and everything only to then renege on his promise. This scenario had happened over and over and over again. What was Paro thinking that he kept reneging on his promise? Chazal tell us that Paro wasn't thinking. As the Torah says throughout the plagues, either Paro hardened his own heart or God hardened Paro's heart for him. So Paro essentially acted and reacted as God wanted him to, as God took away Paro's free will. But how is it possible that God would take away Paro's free will when a person by definition has free will for all their choices? There are many approaches and answers given by the classical commentators, but let's take a bit different approach. When we look at the story of Egypt, we view it from our own perspective, through a Jewish lens. We know the narrative and how the story ends. We know more or less about what God is thinking, as he says outright in the Torah what he wants to happen. What's missing, though, is Paro's perspective. If we want to understand why Paro refused to let Israel go worship God on a 3-day journey in the desert, then we need to try to put ourselves in Paro's shoes and look at things the way he might have seen them. Paro was the leader of the country. As a responsible leader, he needed to worry not just about himself, but about the well-being of Egypt, or at least what he perceived as the good of Egypt. He assessed the situation. The country was experiencing natural disasters brought upon them by an outside divine force. These disasters, while uncomfortable and perhaps temporarily unbearable, resulted in very few deaths or losses. When the pressure of the plague was lifted, Paro looked back and, despite the pain it had caused, felt that the country could absorb the damage the disasters had caused, especially in comparison to the alternative. As Paro expressed multiple times, he was deathly afraid that Israel would leave. They were numerous, possibly greater in number than even the Egyptians themselves. What would happen if a huge number of people had suddenly picked up and left? It could leave Egypt in shambles, something as a leader he must prevent at all costs. As a result, despite the pressure to let Israel leave, Paro was completely invested in the idea of keeping Israel enslaved in Egypt. Even when the plagues became more severe and his own advisors urged him to let Israel go worship God, Paro was too invested to relent. It took the 10th plague, the killing of all firstborn males, including his own son, for Paro to realize that his unwavering commitment to his investment had actually caused diminishing returns. But it was now too late to prevent an even greater tragedy. His own actions had caused his worst nightmare to come about. When someone is deeply invested in something, changing tactics can be challenging because it means admitting and accepting that the original intent was flawed. This can be very difficult as it requires acknowledging the consequences of those actions. However, we can learn from Paro's example and hope that it won't take a major setback to convince someone to change course. Shabbat Shalom.